I would like to begin today's webinar with a story about this guy, Herbie Hancock. Herbie Hancock was a young jazz pianist who would go on to be one of the greats. And he received a very special invitation. He was invited round to Miles Davis's house to audition for Miles' band. And this was a big deal. Miles had invited him to come round to the house and to play for a few days, just to jam with the rest of the band. Now, Herbie was really nervous. He was nervous because this was a massive opportunity and a huge stepping stone in his career. But he was nervous too because Miles had a reputation as a really, really tough taskmaster. So Herbie arrives and he starts to play. And sure enough, within just a few minutes, Miles starts to look a bit kind of unhappy, a bit edgy, and he just chucks his trumpet down on a sofa and storms off. And Herbie's only recently arrived, and he's like, well, fuck, I'm here for a few days, so I might as well just get on and jam with these musicians. And he does. And after 3 days, Miles suddenly appears with a big smile on his face. And Herbie's like, what's going on? And Miles says, I've been upstairs listening on an intercom all the time. I heard what I was looking for because I wasn't in the room. And I think this is a really, really lovely story that illustrates one of the most important principles of creative leadership, which is our topic for this afternoon, that you have to know when to step in, but you also need to know when to step back. We will return to Miles Davis later on in the presentation. I think it's going to take about an hour. I've never done this one before. I'll make the recording available at the end. There will be time for questions. If you've got anything to ask, chuck it in the box. Shall we go? Are we ready? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Oh, yes. Are you still there? Have I scared you off? So weird doing these things. Thanks, Daphne. Thanks, Marlo. Cheers, guys. Okay, let's go. Become a better creative leader. So here's the thing. You have been a maker for your career. You've made some great work. Now you've got to go to become an enabler. You've got to go from making great work to creating the right conditions for great work to be made. And that's a really different set of skills. It's quite a change, and very few people are taught how to do it. We're just kind of expected to get on with it. The big thing for me is that I've always believed that creativity is not a democracy. I am a left liberal leaning person. I do believe in democracy, but not in the context of creativity. There's that quote attributed to Henry Ford. If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Apparently he never said that, but it illustrates a point. Creativity needs people to make difficult calls, to step away from convention, to make the tough choices. And this is the role of a creative leader. So I see it a bit like being a benign dictator. The interests of your people are very much one of your principal concerns, but you are there and you are going to call the shots. You're also a guardian of creativity. As a creative director within an organization, there's going to be other people, finance people and business people and sales people, all these kind of things. You're the one who is the creative soul of your organization, and that's a really important role. You must also be a gentle nurturer. A spark of an idea is a very, very fragile thing, and you must identify which sparks deserve to be nurtured, to be encouraged, to turn into flames. At the same time, you have to be a ruthless editor. I think one of the most important jobs of a creative director is not so much about adding things, but about taking things away, being really, really disciplined about removing anything which isn't serving the idea. You also have to be a salesman. You've got to be able to persuade people within your organization, maybe people outside of your organization, of the inherent value of your creative ideas. And maybe most importantly, you've got to be a helicopter pilot, not literally, obviously, or if you're a very successful creative director, maybe you get a helicopter. Who knows? But you've got to be able to pull right up and take the bigger view, and occasionally know when to go right down and zoom in and deal with detail. That was the first 9 minutes. I think it's going all right so far. I'm going to share 10 observations, lessons, principles, which you can use if you are a creative leader today or you are hoping to become one tomorrow. And the first is this: you having a raison d'etre, a reason for being, a rationale. You could make a good case, I think, that Niels Leonard, the founder of the agency Uncommon, is a creative leader, maybe responsible for some of the best, most effective, most rewarding advertising work in the UK at the moment. And he says the process to great work is not luck or a fluke or some sort of jazz created by some genius in your company. We're really ruthless. We get in a room and we go, why is that going to be famous? Why is anyone going to care? I've distilled that down to this, an acronym, WSAGAF. Why should anyone give a fuck? This is a question, as a creative leader, you need to be asking in two contexts. The first is at the beginning of the process, with your client's brand. Why should anybody give a monkeys about this brand now in 2025 with all the chaos and the noise and the horrendous stuff going on? What is about this product or service or thing that is meaningful in people's lives? And that's the way in that you're going to take your team. And then when you're making the work, you ask the same question again. Why should anyone give a fuck about this commercial or this branding or this activity? Has it got any intrinsic value? Is it delivering somebody a benefit? Because if it isn't, then it fails. There's a transaction that is critical, I think, but often overlooked. You're asking people for their time, and we know that time is the one thing people don't have these days. Maybe money too, but that's a different webinar. But you're asking for people's time. What are you going to give them in return? And as a creative director, I think that transaction, that equation, you must always be mindful of. When I was working as a creative director, which I did for about 15 years, I had a thing which I called the more than once test. And when an idea was just at the sort of genesis stage, I would imagine it existing in the real world. And I would imagine I'd encountered it 2 or 3 or 4 times. Would it still deliver some kind of value or reward to me? Did it have that thing where if I saw it more than once, I'd be happy to see it or encounter it again? And that's a really good test. Every creative leader is different. And I think every creative leader should have their own vision. And this is something I often work with when I'm doing one-to-one creative coaching with my clients. And if you look around, you see this in great creative leaders. David Ogilvy, one of the British advertising greats, has these 5 values: enviable, strategic, surprising, original, and timeless. Dieter Rams, the designer, has 10 principles of good design. The way to arrive at your manifesto, I mean, you probably sort of know this intuitively, but the way to make it explicit is to collate work you love, not just work that you've made, but work that you see around that you wish you'd made. Ask yourself, what is going on under the bonnet? What is making that work so effective? And then you extrapolate those principles and start to build a kind of manifesto. This is a process that I went through early on in my creative direction careers. And those of you who have attended some of the other stuff that I've done in the past will know that I have 5 values: simplicity, originality, truth, craft, and reward. And I'm always testing ideas against these principles. Is it simple? Can I describe it in a single sentence? Does it feel subtly different to anything that's gone before? Is there an element of surprise? Is it based upon a meaningful insight? Is it truthful? Can it be executed with skill, craft? And then does it have that reward, that intrinsic value, that something that it gives the viewer or the reader or the listener for spending time with it? Let's talk now about your team. That's enough about you for the time being. A story about a place called Building 20. Building 20 was a building on the campus of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. When the Americans entered the Second World War, they decided that the Allies need to improve their radar technology. So they instructed MIT to get on the case. So MIT got a bunch of scientists together but had nowhere to put them. So it threw up this building, which became known as Building 20. It was made out of plywood, breeze blocks, and asbestos. The idea was that it would only be up for as long as the war, and so they really just threw it together. It was freezing cold in winter, boiling hot in summer, and it was a rubbish building. When the war ended, the GI Bill was introduced, which meant that returning GIs were entitled to a university education. And suddenly MIT had this big influx of new students, and so it had to put them somewhere. It put them in Building 20. It couldn't knock Building 20 down. And then over the next few years, something really, really remarkable began to happen. It became a hotbed of innovation and creativity. The world's first atomic clock was built there. Harold Edgerton did his groundbreaking work with high-speed photography. The world's first email was sent there in 1961. The world's first video game, Space War, was developed in Building 20. Leo Baranek created his anechoic chambers, which is a room so quiet that you could hear the sound of your own heartbeat. Big influence on John Cage, the avant-garde musician. Noam Chomsky did his groundbreaking work in linguistics in Building 20, and Amir Bose did the audio and sound work, which would lead to him setting up the Bose Foundation. 9 Nobel Prize winners passed through Building 20 before its eventual demolition in 1998. And when it was demolished, they held a wake for it, and it had become known as the Magical Incubator. Now, I've always been fascinated by this story. What was it about this building that made it such a site for innovation, creativity, and groundbreaking work? Well, in brief, it was an endlessly flexible hodgepodge of disciplines. So there were musicians and computer scientists and linguistic experts and historians and all kinds of different disciplines thrown together in this haphazard building. The walls were very thin, so if you needed to change the room for a particular experiment, you could just knock a wall down, move plug sockets around. The room numbering system was really confusing, so people would wander into the wrong room or end up in the wrong meeting. So there was this beautiful diversity of disciplines and this really flexible environment. And those two conditions meant that it just spawned all sorts of ideas, because somebody from one discipline would bump into somebody from another discipline, and they would find this intersection between the work that they've been doing that made an idea greater than the sum of its parts. Creativity depends upon this flexibility. It depends upon diversity of disciplines, as we see in Building 20, but diversity of all kinds, cognitive diversity, diversity of lived experience, age, race, gender. The more you can mix it up, the more diverse your team, the richer the creative output will be. Another really interesting thing when it comes to creativity is that a little bit of dissent can do wonders. There are a couple of psychologists, Charlene Nemeth and Julian Kwan, and they ran a free association test. It's quite famous. This is the paper. And it went a bit like this. So a room full of about 15 people was shown a colour slide, and they were asked to call out the colour and then to come up with associations with that colour. So the psychologist would show them a green slide, everybody would shout out green. About 20% of people, 40% of people would say grass if you show them a green slide. Another 40% would say red, yellow, or blue. Z would say tree in the chat box. Nice one, Z. Yeah, but most people, you're in the 20%, but most people would say the colour, say a colour, or say something like grass. So only 20% would say island, money, leaves, or tree. Same with blue. Everybody shouts out blue. 40% of people say sky. There we go. 40% say red, yellow, or green, and only 20% would say jeans, lake, or lonely, or ocean, Caitlin. Then the experimenters did a little twist. Eve Klein, nice. It does look a bit like an Eve Klein blue. Maybe that's why I picked it. They put an actor in the room, and now when they put up a blue slide, the actor shouted out green. And almost all the responses got far more interesting. People said things like pornography for blue, or jazz for blue, or Picasso. Why is this? What's going on? Well, good ideas are more likely to emerge in environments that contain a certain amount of noise or error. When somebody says something that is not consistent with our worldview, could even be wrong, it forces us to re-examine our assumptions, to question things we've taken for granted, and that is critical to the creative process. I've got a little quote here. Minority viewpoints are important, not because they tend to prevail, but because they stimulate divergent attention and thought. As a result, even when they're wrong, they contribute to the detection of novel solutions that, on balance, are qualitatively better. So having that one person on your team that pipes up with the weird things now and again, hang on to that person. They are serving a valid function, even if what they say is not correct. They're forcing people to think a little bit differently. And one of the problems creative teams face over time, indeed any team face over time, is that they tend to get more homogenous. People hire people who think like them, who see the world like them, who have similar lived experiences. You've got to be really, really careful that doesn't happen to your team. The most important gift you can give them is psychological safety. You will have heard this expression, I'm sure. Really what it means is creating an environment where people do not feel afraid to say something that could be wrong, and where they feel that they have permission to take risks. Google did a study of their highest performing teams, and they found that individuals on teams with higher psychological safety are less likely to leave Google. They're more likely to harness the power of diverse ideas from their teammates. They bring in more revenue, and they're rated as effective twice as often by executives. Psychological safety is one of the most important characteristics you can inculcate in the environment in which you work. Don't forget Strummer's Law too. Anybody know Strummer's Law? I've talked about Strummer's Law before. I'm just going to throw it out there. Friday afternoon, pub quiz time. No pints yet. Nobody knows Strummer's Law. That's good. It means some of this stuff's new. Richard knows Strummer's Law. No Inuit or no Inuit. You got to keep playing. Input, yes. No input, no output, Joe Strummer said. As a creative leader, you may be focusing a lot on your team's creative output. That's fair enough. But don't neglect to keep them topped up with the good stuff. We talked about you, we talked about your team. Let's talk now about the process. Forgive me if I'm rattling through this, but we've got a fair amount to get through. And you can always watch me on the web, on the recording later on. Somerset Maugham said, there are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are, which I think is really nice. However, when it comes to the creative process, I think we can break it down. And I think even though it's magical and mysterious and it's beautiful because of that, there are things that we can say. I think there are 7 stages. And the more intimate and cognizant of these stages you are as a creative leader, the better you are at trafficking your team through the process. So those 7 stages are interrogate, explore, incubate, flow, evaluate, refine, and execute. Interrogate. This is where you understand the client's problem. Most briefs are terrible, and that's why I do a workshop on briefs. This, however, is my favorite brief. It's the Coca-Cola bottle design brief from 1915. A bottle so distinct that it could be recognized by touch in the dark or when lying broken on the ground. Boom, beautiful. Maybe one of the best briefs of all time. A single sentence. Briefs should be brief, but they rarely are. 3 things you should be thinking about. I just held up 4 fingers there, but 3 things you should be thinking about. Who are we talking to? What are we telling them? And most importantly of all, why should they care? That's the way into making great work. Get the brief down to a single sentence. This is good because it forces you to focus on what's really, really important. And it gives you, as the creative director, a touchstone against which you can evaluate the work as you move through the process. The exploration phase is all about making sure everybody has the compost they need from which a seed of an idea can grow. And people often overlook this stage. So this is where you're hunting around for reference imagery, things that you've seen, conversations with consumers, real people. You just fill your head with that beautiful mulch that is going to create the sort of foundations for a really fertile foundations for an idea to grow. Incubate. I have a podcast called The Wind Thieved Hat, and the reason I called it The Wind Thieved Hat is because I was reading a book about Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, Laurel and Hardy. Stan Laurel was the one who came up with the gags and the scripts, and one day he was stuck. And John Connolly, who wrote the book, said, sometimes you have to sit back and let the ideas come to you rather than chasing after them like a man in pursuit of a wind-thieved hat. And I call the podcast The Wind Thieved Hat because it seemed to illustrate this really fundamental truth about the creative process, which is the more we chase great ideas, the more elusive they become. Psychologists have identified a bunch of different ways that human beings think. The 2 that are important to the creative process are analytical thinking and spontaneous thinking. Analytical thinking, that's the thinking you do when you know that you're thinking, when you sit down and you try and solve a problem. It's conscious, it's logical, and it gives you access only to a limited amount of neural processing power. It's effective to understand the brief and to evaluate ideas, but it's not so good at coming up with ideas. For that, you need spontaneous thinking. This is the thinking that happens when you're not aware that you're thinking. We used to think when we were at rest, our brains were at rest, but they're not. You know, the brain is like taking the opportunity to network together in all kinds of beautiful, surprising ways. And your best ideas happen when you're not consciously thinking about the problem. We all kind of know this. You know, you will have had that experience of having an idea in the shower or when you're out for a walk, rather than when you're sitting behind a desk. We do our best thinking when we're not thinking. So Einstein would play the violin. Margaret Atwood, one of my creative heroes, goes for a walk. Walking leads to rumination. Rumination leads to poetry. Me, when I'm not injured, because I'm 52 and I keep getting bloody injured, but when I'm not injured, I like to go running in the mountains. That's where my ideas come. A lot of people, it's in the shower. You know, you're doing this thing that you've done thousands of times before. You've got the white noise of the water, and it's just perfect conditions for an idea to come. So you've got to give your team the space, the freedom. You know, that's changed a lot in the last few years. But when I was working as a creative at the BBC, I used to ask for time out of the office, and that was where I came up with my best ideas. It was often where I'd end up in the pub with the guy that I used to write with, but we'd have ideas there too. You know, you've got to allow your team that latitude, that space away from the desk. Maybe you've got to push them away from their desk sometimes if they're particularly diligent. Flow is the next stage. It's an expression coined by the psychologist with the most confusing name in psychology, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And it's where the ideas are just coming through you. Let me tell you a story now about pottery. Don't know if anybody watched the Great Pottery Throwdown. very good middle-aged television. Pottery teacher. One morning, her class come in of about 20 students, and she says to them, right, class, we're going to do something different today. I'm going to divide you down the middle. You 10, by lunchtime, I want you to have made the perfect pot. You don't have to make lots of pots. You don't have to make a few pots. You just got to make one pot, and it's got to be perfect. You guys, I want you to make as many pots as you possibly can. Doesn't matter if they're any good or not. All I want to see from you is volume. Lunchtime comes. These guys over here, the perfect pot people, are stressed and strung out, and they're swearing, and they've each got a pot, but it's kind of overworked. The clay's sort of, got problems, and they're just looking pissed off. These guys over here, the as many pots as possible people, they've got loads and loads of pots, and they look tired, but they're kind of tired in a good way, And a lot of those pots are really, really great pots because they weren't worrying about the quality of their pots. Quantity is the path to quality in creativity. And the big problem is people focus on quality and they get stuck. So your sole job is to get as much volume as you can out of your team. And this is where psychological safety comes in, Park quality. Quality will come. It's all about volume. More ideas means more great ideas. I was going to go off on another story, but I'll save that for another day. And suffice to say, what's the name of that scientist who came up with the light bulb? Pub quiz time. He was the man who gets attributed for the invention of the light bulb. Edison. Thanks, Sat. Cheers, Nick. Sat beat you to it, but I think you spelled it right. Thomas Edison. He said, remember this, when you've exhausted all possibilities, you haven't. Right, brainstorms. Brainstorms get a bad press, and justifiably so, I think, because they're used really badly. Here are my observations on the phenomenon we call brainstorms. Never invite your team to sit down and come up with ideas off the bat. It doesn't work. You come up with conventional derivative ideas if you come up with any at all. Make a brainstorm a show and tell. Make sure everybody's had some time to think about the brief, some time to look for references, some time to explore, and some time to come up with some early ideas, and then they bring them along. And then you can build on those ideas. That, to me, is critical. Keep the group small. You don't want more than 5 people, because then it gets too unwieldy. The quieter people get really, really intimidated. The louder people dominate. Listen to everyone. And you can try a thing called brain writing. Brain writing is where everybody writes down one idea on a post-it. You stick them on the wall, and then you go through them one by one. And it's a real nice way of making sure everybody is heard. Psychological safety, again, make sure people feel they've got license to say the stupid thing. As some of you may know, I always like to begin with, what's the worst idea we can come up with? And that immediately removes that terrible thing of trying to say something that sounds good. Your job as the person hosting the brainstorming session is to build momentum. You try to create an energy in the room. So I find yes and being the thing that stand-up comics use, yes and improvisational comics. It's a really nice thing. So somebody says something and you say yes, and what if we, but no buts. You don't want to be saying we can never do that because the client hasn't got a big enough budget or any of that stuff. Somebody says something that you think's not quite right. You don't say that's not quite right. You just see how you can build on it. Remember always that the people with the loudest voices don't necessarily have the best ideas. This is one of the big issues with brainstorms. There are those people who it really suits, extroverts, and there are those people who it really doesn't suit, introverts. There's a lovely book that's on my shelf somewhere called Quiet. a book for introverts in a world that doesn't stop talking, I think it's called, by Susan Cain. And I read in that on average, in a 4-person group, 2 people do 62% of the talking. And in a 6-person group, 3 people do 70% of the talking. The larger the group, the worse the problem. And the people doing all the talking typically believe everyone is speaking equally. I'm sure we've all been in that situation. So don't mistake assertiveness or eloquence for good ideas. Then you've got evaluation. Conventional ideas often feel comfortable because they're familiar to us. Edison, I think, no, this was Einstein, said if an idea is not at first absurd, then there is no hope for it. And it's important that as a creative director, I think you recognize that those moments where you feel a little bit uncomfortable, where something feels like, oh, I'm not sure about that, that's often a clue that there's something really interesting or exciting. And a poor creative director will step back from it at that point because it feels awkward and unfamiliar. A good creative director will step into that moment. So when you're evaluating, first thing you do is revisit the brief. You look back and maybe against your single sentence and see how well the work delivers. And then you can ask yourself 4 questions and use these questions to filter out the good from the bad. Number 1, which idea is the most creatively exciting? Which is the one that gets my heart beating, the one that I think we'll put on our show reel? 2, if I was the client, which one would I pick? So if my job is to sell Zinger burgers, I'm going with Z's KFC thing just there in the comments. Which one do I think would be most likely to deliver that? Different sensibility. Then which idea could be executed best given the resources? You know what budget you have, you know how much time you've got, you know you've got available to work on it. So that's a good filter. And then this is a really good test, which is the idea that couldn't carry a competitor's logo. That is a really good test to find out if the work is on brand or not. And if it can carry a competitor's logo, then it's not sufficiently on brand, or your client's brand is not distinctive enough. Also, be mindful of your manifesto at this point. So I'd be thinking about simplicity, originality, truth, craft, and reward. Then you got to the refine stage. A creative hero of mine, Marina Abramovich, describes the process more and more of less and less. And that, I think, is a really lovely way of seeing it, that as the creative director, you want to take anything away that's getting in the way of amplifying the core message. Is every element earning its keep? Is it doing the job? The more you cut, the closer you get to the truth. A designer knows they've achieved perfection, not when there's nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. Finally, we've got to make the thing. We've got to execute. When it comes to execution, I would like to pay a tribute now to the recently departed, much lamented David Lynch. Although I have a funny feeling that wherever he is, he's having a great time. One of the books that I have on David Lynch is this, which is a collection of his meditations on meditation. And there's a chapter called Ask the Idea. The idea is the whole thing. If you stay true to the idea, it tells you everything you need to know, really. You just keep working to make it look like that idea looked, feel like it felt, sound like it sounded, and be the way it was. And it's weird because when you veer off, you sort of know it. You know when you're doing something that is not correct because it feels incorrect. He says, no, this isn't like the idea said it was. And when you're getting into it the correct way, it feels correct. It's an intuition. You think your way through. You start one place, and as you go, it gets more and more finely tuned. But all along, it's the idea talking. At some point, it feels correct to you, and you hope that it feels somewhat correct to others. And I think if you look at David Lynch's films, you can see that fidelity to the idea. He'd let himself go wherever the idea took him. Final thing is that if you're really excited about the technique, and this happens a lot, you know, if you've got some beautiful visual effect or something smart you're doing with AI, take the time to question the idea. Often when we fall in love with the technique, it's because there is no idea behind it. Okay, We've got 20 minutes left. I'm going to continue rocketing through if everybody's all right. Next up is know your vertebrae. So the client has got a problem. You're going to arrive at a solution. There are 4 steps to getting there that you need to understand. 4 vertebrae, you might call them. The challenge, the insight, the idea, and the execution. It's really important for you as the creative director up there in your helicopter that you are clear on what each of these is. Because often your creatives won't be. And the more you understand these 4 vertebrae, the more adaptable, flexible, the more elegantly and more agile you can be in how you move around the idea. So the challenge is the problem you've been asked to solve. The insight is a compelling observation you know to be true about the product, the marketplace, or the lives of your audience. It's the reason your idea makes sense. It's a stepping stone from the problem to the idea. The idea is your core concept, elegantly expressed in a single sentence. You should always be able to express your idea in a single sentence. And the execution is how you plan to bring your concept to life. So let's have a look now at one of the things I'm most proud of having worked on, which is the Studio Canal ident. So that was a project we did in 2009 with my friend Grant from DBLG. So the challenge here was to create a timeless cinema ident for Studio Canal. That was the brief in brief. Our insight was that cinema is conjured from light and glass. When you think about it, you know, you've got the lens of the camera, the light bouncing off the subject, and then in the movie theatre, you've got the light projected through the lens of the projector. So our idea was to create the ident from just these 2 elements, light and glass. And our execution was we created this glass installation, glass sculpture, and we projected Studio Canal movies through it. Challenge, insight, idea, execution. It's a bit like a slinky going down the stairs, you know? The challenge, the insight, the idea, and the execution. There's a beautiful flow between these 4 things, and it feels like they're kind of equidistant. And I just love this endless gif of a slinky going on forever. It's quite mesmerizing and satisfying. It pleases me. So once you understand these 4 vertebrae, then you can move up and down them. And if the insight feels good, but the idea is not quite right, then you can back up to the insight and ask the creatives to work on some more ideas. Or if the execution is not the right one for the idea. So having that sort of strategic overview, flexibility is a really, really helpful tool. Tough on work, kind to people. So creatives are sensitive, you know, as human beings. It's why they make good creatives. Rick Rubin writes about this nicely in his recent book, The Creative Act. You know, to be creative, you need this sort of enhanced awareness and sensibility to the world, but that creates a vulnerability. So it's really important that you are tough on work, but kind to people, you know, and so often, I think this has got a lot better, but in the past, a lot of creative directors were dicks, really. You know, it was just what was expected, that you were sort of supposed to be a kind of Gordon Ramsay type figure. But the more you nurture your people, the better it is for your output. There's that lovely expression from Maya Angelou, lovely quote. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, people will never forget how you made them feel. And holding people, nurturing people, giving people space, encouraging them is is such an important part of your role as a creative leader, and people will thank you for it. Always aim to listen more than you speak, and often an inexperienced or an uncomfortable creative director will talk more than they listen. Begin any conversation about work with a brief recap of the brief and give the creative time to explain their approach. If you're watching a cut, watch it twice. First time you watch it as a viewer and you're just absorbing it. Second time you watch it as a creative director. Expect to be surprised, and if you feel a little bit uncomfortable, as we've said, that's often a good sign. Give feedback face to face first, but always follow up in writing. I think that's really helpful, because when you have to write something down, you've got to be succinct, you've got to be clear, you've got to choose the right word, and your intuitive feedback verbally is fine, but then coming back, having another round where you really think about what you try to communicate is always a healthy thing to do. I was going to play you. Okay, I'll play it. It's this is the first thing I made when I set up my agency, but it was just me in my bedroom. I got a gig for National Geographic, and this was the very first thing that I did, and I was completely winging it. It was the first thing I did, and it actually, I think, turned out well. Thank you, Nick. That's very kind. Cheers, Beck. Oh, you guys. You can tell how old it is by that typography, though, can't you? Oof. Anyway, the reason I'm showing you this is because when I did the rough cut, I worked with an editor and director, and Johan Tappert was the director. And I was in Soho, cut and run, and I was really nervous about the client coming. Because this is a big deal, you know. And the client arrived. Here he is, Guy Slattery, now a friend of mine, and he watched it. I played it twice to him. He watched it. He said, "Yeah, it's great. Do you fancy a beer?" I was like, "Oof, Jesus! Nobody's ever said that. No client's ever done that before." But Guy thought it worked. He was really happy with it. He was consistent with what he'd expected, and he didn't feel the need to make any changes whatsoever. You don't have to find something wrong. There's a lovely line from Leo Burnett: any fool can write a bad ad, but it takes a genius to keep his hands off a good one. And I think often a lesser creative director will feel they need to make a change for the sake of justifying their role. But sometimes you don't need to. Always remember the golden rule too. Put the problem before the solution when you're giving feedback. There's a really nice formula that Helen at Fox shared with me. Like, concern, suggest. When you've got to give feedback to your team, keep this in mind. Like, concern, suggest. You say what you like, you say what your concern is, you suggest a solution, but you invite the creative solution. I really like the way you've handled X. Takes the heat off. So the creative goes, "Ah, oh, cool, okay, I can relax." Then you say, "I think there could be an issue with Z. Based on the brief, I think we've got a bit of an issue here. We could solve it by trying Y." You know, you offer a solution because you're the creative director, but I'm curious to see how you might solve it. Like, concern, suggest, and it's a really great way of handling feedback. Quick story about my mother-in-law, which I shared on LinkedIn. Mary, who I'll be seeing later on in the pub tonight, was a primary school teacher here in Wales. And when she had a teacher that was struggling with their class, she'd tell them to come in the next day with 10 stones. And she'd say, "Right, put 5 stones in your right pocket, 5 stones in your left pocket. And this is your good pocket, and this is your bad pocket. Next time you got the class, when you criticize them, shout, you tell them off, you take a stone from the good pocket and you put it in the bad pocket. When you praise them, encourage them, congratulate them on the work. You take a stone from the bad pocket and you put it in the good pocket. Without fail, what the teacher would find is that about halfway through the lesson, the bad pocket is full of stones. They've been criticizing and shouting and doing all this negative stuff way more than they've been praising and encouraging. Then they've got to try and get the stones into the other pocket. And Mary said that this was always the path to getting the behavior of their class to transform. As human beings, we respond so much better to praise and encouragement than we do to criticism. And this is one of my flaws when I started off as a creative director. I had really, really high standards. And I did not praise my team enough. I wanted everything to be as good as it can possibly be. And so I was too quick to come in and criticize and find fault. And I learned the hard way over time that that was not the best way to get the best work out of my team. There was a study done that found in high performing teams, positive to negative comments, almost 6-1, medium performing teams, 2-1, low performing teams, it's the other way around. It's almost 3 negative comments for every positive comment. It really makes a big difference. There was also a study done that found that in the NBA, that found that players with abusive coaches were less efficient and committed more technical fouls even 10 years after leaving their coaches. It continued to damage them for the rest of their careers. So what you say to your team doesn't just affect them now in 2025 on your team, but it's going to affect them in the future. It's a big responsibility. So just remember Mary's stones. Okay, we've got 10 minutes left. I'm going to have to dash. Accentuate the positive. Oh, yes. Do you want to be right or do you want what's best for the work? Sometimes you've got to move your ego out of the way. And don't be a seagull. You know what I mean by a seagull? Don't do the swoop and poop. This is where you kind of swan in. I'm mixing my bird metaphors here. You swan in, you go, oh no, we can't do that. And then you disappear. If you identify a problem that you want solving, you've got to make yourself available to see the iterations, the path to solving that problem. Don't do the swoop and poop. Scare yourself a little bit now and again. Regular viewers will have seen this clip from David Bowie, but it's amazing. So I'm going to play it to you again.
A play to the gallery, I think. But you never learn that until much later on, I think. But never work for other people at what you do. Always remember that the reason that you initially started working was that there was something inside yourself that you felt that if you could manifest it in some way, you would understand more about yourself and how you coexist with the rest of society. And I think it's terribly dangerous for an artist to fulfill other people's expectations. I think they generally produce their worst work when they do that. And the other thing I would say is that if you feel safe in the area that you're working in, you're not working in the right area. Always go a little further into the water than you feel you're capable of being in. Go a little bit out of your depth. And when you don't feel that your feet are quite touching the bottom, you're just about in the right place to do something exciting.
It was the second bit of that clip that thanks guys, thanks David, that I wanted to isolate. When you're just a little bit out of your depth, you're in the right place to do something interesting. And this is the thing you've got to really watch out for as a creative director. You know, you may have some early successes and be inclined to repeat those things and to stay where you are, but you've got to continue to push yourself, to continue to feel uncomfortable. There's a great book by Adam Alter called The Anatomy of a Breakthrough. And in that book, he posits, by looking at the careers of great artists and scientists and innovators, that they have a failure rate of about 1 in 6, 15.87%. Just enough to show that you're pushing the envelope, you're working in the space that you're unfamiliar with, but not so much that, you know, your superiors lose faith in you or you lose faith in yourself. Almost there. Know when to step in and when to step back. Another story about our friend Miles Davis. So John McLaughlin, guitarist, was invited to play for Miles, and he was similarly nervous, like Herbie Hancock, and he was fluffing it. And Miles took a deep breath and said to him, "Just play it like you don't know how to play the guitar." And John said in an interview afterwards, that was all it took, for the pressure to be off, the heat to be removed. He told me to play it like I didn't know how to play the guitar. When all that expectation was gone, then I was able to play it. And I think this is really important. It's having that sensibility of knowing when to step in and when to step back. A friend of mine, Tony Pipes, who was is now CD at the Royal Opera House, he describes it as providing air cover for your team. So you're there to kind of shield them, and it requires you to take ownership of failure, but to credit your team with success. If things go wrong, you take that hit. If things are going right, you make sure that they get the credit. You can't do everything. As your team, I had 20 people working with me by the end of my agency, and I couldn't do everything that I wanted to do. I had to learn to focus on the things where I could make the most difference. I also learned that it was really important to keep my own hand in as a creative. For the first few years as a creative director, I stopped coming up with ideas, just supervised ideas, and I had a real loss of self-confidence. It was only after I started feeling that I got back into writing and doing my own, doing my own bits of design and stuff, and that gave me the confidence again. I think that's really important. And finally, just be you. The main source of imposter syndrome is denying who we are and pretending to be somebody we're not. And I think you will probably agree with me that the best creative leaders you've ever encountered are people who just authentically and absolutely themselves. They weren't trying to live up to some perceived notion of what a creative director should be. They were just honest and human, and they accepted and acknowledged their fallibility. And I think the more we do that, the better we all are generally. I interviewed a palliative care doctor, Dr. Catherine Mannix, from my podcast a few years ago, and she said this wonderful, wonderful thing. We limp to wisdom over the hot coals of our mistakes. Bind your feet now and keep walking. I love that very much. And I think, we're now at the end almost of my thing. And these are the lessons I've learned as a creative director. But I wasn't perfect, a long way from it. And I think the more comfortable we are with recognizing our fallibility, recognizing that mistakes are inevitable and things will go wrong. And if we push ourselves, we're in a space where we're taking risks, the better that journey will be, even though those coals might sting on the soles of our feet now and again. Before I do a little recap, two things I've got to tell you about. The first is I'm doing a thing. Some of you will know about this, the Creative Retreat, 3 days in that farmhouse you can see there on the side of the mountain, which is called the Skirrid, here in Wales. It's happening June the 17th to the 19th. 12 people. I've got a few spaces left. 3 days of being in the countryside, natural swimming, talks, workshops. Going to be an automatic drawing workshop. I'm going to be doing some stuff. It's creative rejuvenation. You can find out more. I've got a link. Here's a link. Can I do this? The Creative Retreat. Share now. Bingo. There's a link. You can click on that link. Because it's Friday, I'm going to say if any of you guys wants to book it in the next week, I will give you 20% off. How about that? Just for you guys and nobody else. So you've got to have been on this call. You book it in the next week, and you can book in installments. So that's happening. That's a thing. What else can I tell you? I've got masterclasses too. This webinar is part of a half-day masterclass with a bunch of other stuff and some exercises. It's how I make my living. This is free. My masterclasses aren't. So I'm sharing that now. Please, if you work for an organization, you'd like a bit of inspiration, encourage them to get me in. If there's anybody in your network who you think might benefit from some of the things I've shared this afternoon, please distribute that freely. So to recap then, it's almost 2 o'clock. We're going to do it. You're going from being a maker to an enabler, from making great work to creating the conditions for great work to be made. Define your vision. Look at great work, deconstruct it, work out what your particular creative vision is. Remember the transaction. You're asking people for their time. What are you going to give them in return? Encourage diversity of all kinds in your team. The more diverse your team, the richer your creative output. Your job is to engender psychological safety. Make people feel comfortable with saying the silly thing. Quantity delivers quality. Focus on quantity, quality will come. Know the 4 vertebrae. Challenge, insight, idea, execution. Be able to move up and down that ladder at will. Be tough on work, particularly at the end of the process, but always kind to people. Zoom in, zoom out. You're either a helicopter or a telephoto lens. I can't decide on the metaphor. Above all, be yourself. Just be you, and people will love you for it. I think we're almost there. That's it. Thanks, guys. That was close. I hope that wasn't too much of a dash. As I say, it was the first time I've done it, so I wasn't quite sure how long it was going to take. Thank you, guys. If anybody has any questions, then please ask me them. Genesis, what a wonderful name. Is that your real name, Genesis? Has a question. This webinar will be recorded and shared. This webinar will be recorded. Yes, I think so, if I press the right buttons. What I'll do is post it on my YouTube page, The Creative Coach, and I will share a link to that. You're welcome, Laura, Nick, Steve, Beth. That's very kind. And it is indeed Genesis. Well, thanks for coming along this afternoon. I'll hang around for Jazzy too. Nice, I'll take that, Matt. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask. But if not, feel free to bugger off and have a pint and do whatever you're going to do this Friday afternoon. Have a wonderful weekend. Send in love to everybody out there. It's a tough time for the creative industries. I'm guessing it's a tough time for some people on this call. So if it is, you're not alone. And together we'll get through this. Keep doing what you do. Creativity is a beautiful thing. Thank you, Z. Cheers, Julia. You're welcome, Mitch. Okay, I'll give it a couple more minutes for questions, and then I will go pick up my friend Dave from the railway station. Thanks, Nick. Please spread the word. Yeah, like I say, it's how I pay the bills. A question: how do you balance giving creatives freedom to explore when there's a tight deadline and/or serious budget restraints? That's a good question, Steve. That's a really good question. And I think it's about having awareness of the process. You know, I talked about the 7 steps of the process. And no matter the tight deadline or the budget restraints, always allowing a sliver of that time for the creatives to go anywhere, you know. It's important that you affirm that, you know, we've got these restrictions, and we're going to need to deliver something that works within these restrictions. So everybody's aware of that. But just for the next hour or Tuesday morning, or depending on the deadline in the next couple of days, I just want you to roam free. And even when there are quite restrictive constraints, allowing that process to happen can mean that you end up somewhere more interesting than you would have got to. And sometimes what I would do as the creative director in those situations is I'd be thinking about it too, and I just to make myself feel more comfortable, I come up with a kind of banker, like I'd write the script in a really straight way, in a way that I knew could be shot really easily. The client wouldn't balk out; they might not get excited, but then you've kind of got a banker, and then that allows you the latitude to go off and explore. So I think always having a little bit of time, even if you've only got a day to work on it, and just to think of the left field idea is really important. Is being a CD like looking after kids? A little bit, but I think looking after kids is a whole lot harder. Because if you've got kids, you've got them 24 hours a day. But I suppose, it is a little bit, because kids have this beautiful creativity. They've got an energy that needs to be channeled. And isn't that really what this is about? It's about channeling energy. It's not about adding something, but it's about shaping that energy in a constructive way. And I guess that's an overlap. Genesis, my YouTube channel is The Creative Coach, I think with underscores in it. Yeah, there's a bunch of webinars and things on there. So please feel free to subscribe. Right then, that's it. Thank you so much. Lots of love. Please follow up on email if you have any questions or observations. I might do another one of these at some point. But for now, take care. God bless. Cheers. Bye-bye.